Okay, so next, without further ado, I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight. Chen-Ming Hu is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He led the development of the 3D transistor that has powered the top computer processors since 2012 and the top Apple phones and Samsung phones since 2015. Also, he and his students continually create the international standard transistor models that have been used to design semiconductor circuits with total value of hundreds of billions of dollars in the past 20 years. He himself has published 5 books and 900 research articles and has been granted 130 US patents. He is also a National Academy member in the US, China, and Taiwan. He is passionate about teaching and has received a University of California, Berkeley's highest honor for teaching, the Berkeley Distinguished Teaching Award. At the same time, Mr. Hu has also been selected to receive the nation's top honors in science and technology by the White House. Finally, Professor Hu is also among the 8 selected to receive the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. And finally, there is something that is not on his bio. How many of you have watched the movie Everest? Some. Okay, so actually, Professor Hu, at the age of 50, climbed Mount Everest. Wow, how amazing. So now, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Professor Hu.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm more than a guest tonight. I have been a member for many decades, and I'm a life member of CIE. CIE was founded 99 years ago. You heard that. I want to add for the real guests this evening that it actually was founded by one of the earliest Chinese students who studied in the US. And I know the members know that. That's Zhan Tianyu, known for building and designing the first Chinese-built and many railroad in China. I was asked to share what I have learned about innovation. I have a confession to make right from the beginning. I'm not sure what innovation means. I never told myself I'm going to do innovation, but I many times told myself I'm going to solve these problems. And after I've solved some difficult problems, people started to say I'm innovative and give me awards for innovation. So I guess when you solve problem well, when you solve important problems, that is innovation. Now, why do I make that point? Well, we know Shakespeare's Romeo answered his own question, basically saying not much. And we also know what that kind of thinking did to him. So, not very good ending, of course. I think what we call this doesn't make a difference. When you think about innovativeness, creativeness, you tend to think it's related to certain personality traits, and therefore probably could not be easily learned or improved. On the other hand, when I call this problem solving, and maybe problem solving a certain style problem solving that other people consider innovation, makes this more reachable. And problem-solving skills, of course, are something that could be learned. And especially for the audience here tonight, we engineers are trained to solve problems. We do that every day. But when you think about innovativeness, creativeness, perhaps to our youngsters, maybe our children, is not as a reachable goal. And I like to really break that myth, that think about innovation as problem solving. That's the way I treat it. If it's a problem, then we can start saying what to do. I always feel that we sometimes don't spend enough time to really understand the problem. So if you think you understand the problem, and I tell the students, spend more time to understand it again. In other words, there may be something you have missed. I want to give you an example. It's not a technical example. I know many of you are interested in news from Taiwan. This is not really news. This is a story that happened several years ago. And a few years ago, a minister of the government asked to meet me for dinner in Burlingame, actually. And so he said, we have had this big problem for 6 months. And this is what the data shows. It says Taiwan's IP import, which means the royalties that Taiwan businesses pay to foreign businesses, has been increasing rapidly, that blue line there, and continue to increase rapidly. And this is 2011, it has reached $6 billion. Now, $6 billion is a lot of money in Taiwan. It actually is significantly more than the budget of Taipei City. And so the minister was asking, do you have some advice? What should we do? Should we squeeze the universities harder to get more patents? What can we do to help the industry? What can the government do? Well, where is the story going? I did not have other advice except for one. I said, in fact, it's a question. I said, do you know who are paying these royalties? I actually had read about discussion of the topic on in newspapers, and I know people were thinking some certain companies that considered to be not innovative, and the answer was, no, we don't know. So apparently no one thought about getting into that, and the reaction was to do something. Committees met, but without even knowing who pays for this. So I said, why don't you find out who paid for this? This data came from Zongyang Yinhang, and government certainly can find out who are the payers of these royalties. Well, a few days later, he called me. He says, well, we found out who were paying these, not what we thought were paying. They're paid by the 3 largest laptop makers of Taiwan. And we talked to them. They were very happy they are paying this royalty because for every laptop they sell, they pay Microsoft $80 for the Windows software. And the fact that this line is going up, meaning they're doing good business. They're very happy for that. So that's the end. And that's just an example of looking at problems, spending time to look into more. Now, since I was not asked to do anything more, this problem just dropped. But if indeed there's some concern and there is a need to generate more valuable IPs in Taiwan, I would have gone after for another gold mine on this graph. Look at the bottom curve, the red curve. That's the IP export of Taiwan. To me, that was more interesting. $1 billion of export. I would want to know who are earning this money and how do they do it. And so this is what I mean by understand the problem and look for the information before hurrying up to solve the problem. The other thing, since it's a problem solving, and if and when we have the luxury of picking our problem, which we don't always have that, I always tell the students in university, for example, to pick a problem that's important. And pick a problem that you don't have to wait for 30 years before it to become useful and make a difference to people's lives. Do something 10 years, 15 years for university, that's a sweet spot. And I think for businesses, that time is even much shorter. And pick the high impact problem, because I think impact probably is what differentiates, quote, ordinary problem solving from innovation. I guess the difference really is people's perception. When people think you have solved an important problem with big impact, they will call that innovation. That's the only difference I can see. It's really just problem solving. So I'll give you an example, probably the most talked about example in the last few years of my work. This is done at UC Berkeley, and it has to do with transistors. But I like to introduce that by starting from the top of this inverted triangle. So electronics, of course, is what the world runs on these days. We all know that. Cell phones, computers, the cloud, the internet. Next to it is a $300 billion a year business called semiconductors. Semiconductors gives intelligence to the electronics and the sensors, and gives us the communication capabilities, cell phone, Wi-Fi. This is all semiconductor. And the tier below that, I call the fabrication. There's about close to $100 billion business, 5 to 10 large companies that manufacture all these chips. And finally, at the very bottom is the transistors. And that's what I chose to work on at the university. This is the electrical switches. It's the fundamental building block of all the circuits that's manufactured, that's used in the electronics. A switch is just what you can think of. It's just like the switch that we turn on the light with when we enter a room. It determines whether electricity flows or not flows. Except here, we make the switches extremely small. In fact, we actually literally can count atoms now. How many tens of atoms are in this direction in a switch? And by making these things small, then we can make them cheap. We make them actually faster, use lower power, so on and so forth. And this idea of everything gets better by making smaller is embedded in something called the Moore's law. Some of you probably have heard about that. And for a long time, people have been predicting Moore's law will come to an end. And this is a story about how we were able to break that end and let it continue for several more decades at least. So the transistors. What's interesting about transistors is that although over the 50 years we've been making them smaller, if you actually look into the change in this transistor over the years hasn't changed much, except it gets very small. Well, before you look at that picture much more, I'm going to use a prop here. What I'm holding in my hand is a garden hose. Imagine there's this garden hose. There's one end for water to come in. We'll call that the source. And in the transistor, we also call the source, if you look at the left-hand side. That's the source of the electrical current in the transistor. Here's the source of the water. The other end, the water drains out. We call it a drain, and indeed there's a drain. In the middle, well, let's not worry what we call that. But more importantly is that on top, between the source and drain, there is a gate. That's something to determine whether the water flows or not flow. Now, allowing water to flow through a pipe, just as in transistor, is not that difficult. The difficult part is how you shut it off. Now, suppose you want to shut off the water flow in this piece of pipe on the lawn. Well, if it's long enough a pipe, you can stand on this hose and maybe get your husband or wife or friend to stand on it with you, and somehow you can do that. The problem comes in when you make this hose smaller and smaller. Now imagine, it's not this long, but rather it's this short. You can only put 2 fingers on it. Now how do you shut this off? And we have exactly the same problem in the transistors, so we make them smaller. So therefore, the problem is that we no longer have a switch that can be switched off. Of course, then you won't have electronics that you can use. And even while you still can switch off, but not off enough, then you leak so much electrical current. That's why our cell phone batteries drain fast. It's limited by the current leakage. What I realized was 2 things, and this is not an aha moment that happened in my dream one night. This is years of work, working with colleagues and students, trying to understand the problem. This is what I said earlier. I'm giving you the simple version. The idea, the problem was twofold. One is that, we really want to make this hose thin and flat. And in fact, there are those thin and flat ones. You probably have seen those. Secondly, you don't really want to shut this off while this hose is lying on the soggy and soft lawn. What you want to do is be able to apply force to both sides. With that picture in mind, I now invite you to look at the left-hand side. That was the transistor of the past 50 years. And indeed, you can only apply force through that gate only on one side. There's nothing on the bottom to stop the current flow. It sounds strange, but that's the way the transistor has worked for 50 years, and that's why people thought that's going to be end, but no one thought about this before. So I turned it this way to make it on the right-hand side. I call that fin fat because it's like the dorsal fin of a shark, like the back fin of a fish. So in that case, that's the flat and the thin hose, number one. And number two, this allows me to put a gate on two sides of the thin hose. Now it's like I can pinch the hose with my fingers from both sides. And another advantage of this is, and therefore solves the leakage problem. Another advantage is this is the first time we are turning this transistor into this vertical direction. I was sitting next to Mayor Showalter, and she was telling me that the city is going to try to encourage building taller low-income housings rather than build the single-family homes. It's the same thing is going to happen from now on in the semiconductor chips. We're not going to build the circuits just by using the real estate that's available on this two-dimensional surface. We're not going to build tall transistors because current only flows on the surface of the semiconductor. By doing this FinFET, we're increasing the surface area. So there are several advantages. Well, to make things simple for you to see the impact of that, Intel have been making all their chip processors since 2012. So therefore, when you send an email today and download something from the Facebook or streaming the video from YouTube, more likely than not, the signal has passed through a chip or processor with this technology. And today, all the high-end Samsung phones and the Apple phones use this FinFET technology, and TSMC, Samsung, Intel are all just competing how to make this faster to the next generation and make it even better. Now, this embedded several examples. One, I pick a problem that is big. Two, we really dig deep enough so that we finally saw something that others did not see. That's to understand the problem. Now, there are other lessons to be learned from these. I found that, yes, you do want to have domain knowledge. This is what jargon engineers say. Domain knowledge meaning the knowledge in the area that's directly related to what you are working on. And in that narrow area, you want to have deeper knowledge, hopefully deeper than others. But I have found that it's very, very useful to also have broad knowledge, things not very close to what you do. Now, of course, it's not possible. You only have so many neurons to know both broad and deep. So I think of it as a mushroom. There's a stem that says you want to know the deep knowledge of your domain. And the top, the cap of the mushroom is that peripheral areas. You really want these areas of your knowledge to extend as far as possible, but you do not have to go deep. I have always had that interest. I remember, as many of you did, to apply for graduate school admission, you have to take a GRE. For engineering, the GRE test is very peculiar. There's no GRE test for civil engineers or for electrical engineers. There's GRE test for all engineering field. Do you remember that? Mechanical and chemical. I know GRE engineering test is not popular now, but for the folks of certain age, you may have remembered that. And so I did 99% on the engineering GRE, better than my quantitative GRE. I just have always been interested in paying attention to the things that are not directly what I do. When I first joined the University of California, I wasn't working on semiconductors. I decided to work on the Highgrade car because I felt that that was the thing that will make a difference at the time. If you see the Quantico date, San Francisco Quantico date 79, and that's a time not far from the Iranian oil embargo. Some of you may even remember we had waited around the block to fill our gas tank of the car. And of course, I wanted to work on that. And that's not even what I did as a PhD student. I studied optical communication. That's my PhD thesis. So I always wanted to look for things that I think would make a difference. And at the same time, I was working on solar cells. That all came to an end, unfortunately, because Reagan became a president, and some of you may remember his goal was to close down or the government funding for renewable energy. By the way, I'm not criticizing him. I'm actually praising him for teaching me a lesson that there are actually some truths in what he said. Government should not pick winners and losers. Indeed, these technology we were doing this too early. The battery technology was not there. The oil price was not low enough. The solar cells are not competitive. And 2 decades later, they become good. But my research by that time was out of date because new materials, new conditions really changed how you want to approach some problems. That's another reason I say you don't want to pick a problem that time horizon is too far away. And this is really a good thing of the US. It doesn't use the government power to push things too strongly, and it really allows individuals to respond to market need. I want to show you an interesting chart to me. This shows the number of students taking courses in electrical engineering and computer science department at UC Berkeley. We are one department called the EECS, but we can separate the courses between the, well, let's just say this is the EECS, this is the courses here. And what we're adding here is we take a course, find out how many students are taking that course, and take another course, how many students taking that, add all the students together, all the numbers together. That's the number of student course of the semester, right? And one point I want to point out is rising very rapidly since after the financial crisis, there was a low there, and now it's reached 10,000. If you think everyone who considers him a major probably take 2 to 3 cores in the major, divided by 2.5, you can see 4,000 majors now. And this just shows this is something very unique to the US. That is, not only the students respond to the job market very rapidly, but also the universities respond very rapidly. We actually readjust internal resources. You know, university's financial problem, the department did not get new resource from the university. We readjust internal resources, put resource to teach what the area the people want. And what people want area is computer science, by the way. And that's where the yellow sign is about. We actually have increased the space to allow students who were admitted into Berkeley as letters and science major, not even College of Engineering. They want to study computer science, and we think they should have the chance to learn that. And when they graduate, for those of you who have children thinking of going to the university, maybe to Berkeley, I'll tell you a little known, perhaps it's not a secret, after all, thousands of students are taking advantage of it, that if you cannot get into the EE and CS program, that's all right. If you are a Berkeley student, letters of science, you know that means most of the students in the university, EECS department will take you in and let you take courses, just like the EECS students. And when you graduate, we actually even give you a degree that says you have taken the letters of science, computer science programs. And it's a highly valuable degree for the graduates. In contrast, again, I want to share some things I have learned during that period when the minister was asking for my advice about how Taiwan would like to is treating this the university. And in a way, it's a sad story about misuse of the concept of innovation and university's role in it. Taiwan feels, first of all, the university is where innovations are created, which actually is a myth. Innovation are created in the industry. I'll be the first one to tell you. Any successes that tell you are exceptions rather than the rule, such as the story I just told you about the FinFET. It's exception rather than the rule. University's job is really to create the workforce to fit what industry need. And that example is here. This is a US university's response. If the industry needs computer science graduates, we'll bend backward to provide that. The Taiwan's response was the opposite. Here is what it is. Oops, I guess I decided not to do that, so that's all right. So let me just finish telling you the story here. Taiwan feels its electronics industry is too large, which I personally totally disagree. And I know I'm looking at the Ban Sichu that's written here. So I'm going to be happy to share my opinion on this. I think it's not too big. In fact, the important thing is what's the opportunity to grow the economy in Taiwan, not whether it's concentrated or not concentrated enough. Instead, the government feels we should develop it's called life science, 生命科技, life science industry. And to implement that policy, then the Ministry of Science Technology now, of course, it's 国科会, then use its budget to implement that technology, that policy. So it has been for years, and in fact, the year I look at 2012, 18% of the 国科会's budget was given to 生命科技 life science, life technology actually, and 8% was given to all the electronics. This is the university research funding. This is the almost the only funding the university will get for its graduate students. Now, if you are a university administrator or professor, how do you respond to that? Of course, you're going to hire more professors in life science and not hire in electronics. And students will go to the life science, not want to go to the electronics. In other words, the misused university and created a large mismatch, in my opinion, of the labor pool and what industry need is. There's an industry that's responsible for 50% of the export, that's electronics, and more than 10 times the employment of the life science industry, but it's only getting half of the funding, all the universities and all the students. And then when the electronic industry are not doing as well as South Korea's electronic industry, then people ask why the universities are not doing their job to innovate. But that's not a point about the innovation, and it's a misuse of the concept of innovation. So innovation could be misunderstood and unfortunately be the cause of bad things. Now back to a few slides finished, some things I learned. You want to find the important problem to solve. Well, how do you solve that? I said you want deep knowledge in the domain and thin but broad knowledge. So I call this mushroom knowledge. It's a picture to help myself remember. The mushroom knowledge, I think, is important. And you want to understand the problem with understand capitalized. And you want to improve the solution again. I will not give you examples, but this is another thing that I found that some colleagues and students, when they first come, don't do that. What they like to do is they get some result, they just want to write a paper and then do something else. I always stop them and say, is this really the best it can do? How about that? How about this? Can we do better? Because if you want to make an impact, then you have to really get the good result and don't declare victory too soon. And this, I think, is a useful thing to remember. The next point, I think, is say you have to really enjoy a long and difficult journey. It will be too romantic an idea that inspiration or not inspiration, or rather innovation is all about getting hit on the head by an apple, and that is the trigger for innovation, the gravity Newton story. That's romanticized. I think Thomas Edison was more on the mark when he said genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And this is why the Valley Engineers is known to put in long hours, and students work on Saturday, Sunday. They're excited, enjoy doing that. I tell students when they feel that this is really not what they want to do, I said, I'm very glad you realized this at this time. It's not too late to do something else, because if you want to be a deep problem solver, you have to really enjoy the journey. I use the word journey because there are a lot of fun things along the way. It was mentioned earlier that I did go to the Everest base camp. I actually did that from the Nepal side as well as from the Tibet side. And I enjoyed the journey. Every little village you pass, an eagle you see, that's the joy. And that's what we have to be prepared for if we want to embark on this. It's a lot of work. And then finally, I'll end with this. What allows you to embark on solving a difficult problem? And what gives you the strength to continue on the journey when it's not clear that there's an end? And that's confidence. And I think confidence is important. I'll give you one example, one story. For a long time, Japan, when its electronics business was still strong, would like to send their good engineers and creative person to first-rate American universities to stay a year as a visiting scholar. So every year I would receive one or two of them. The company not only paid for their relocation and the living expense, they also are required by the university to pay certain, let's say, industry affiliate fees, and that's not cheap. So it's very costly proposition for the company to do that. And these visitors, when they come in, take a desk next to my graduate student and work together, it's obvious they already know a lot. They actually know more than not only my students, even myself. We all learn a lot from these visiting scholars, we call them, or visiting industry fellows. And yet, when they finish the visit, they always thank me and say they're very happy, they learned a lot. And after return to the company, they indeed perform well, are promoted. Many of them are VPs and executive VPs, even CEO now. And South Korea started doing that in the last 10 years. And I was very puzzled for a while. And finally, I concluded what really is that they found out that the best, the group with the reputation of being the most innovative, is no better than he himself. The equipment is not better, people are not smarter, and that gave them the confidence to do better. And I think there's a lesson perhaps for our youngsters and maybe even our children. Give them confidence, and indeed, what I said, the last story I told you was not a legend, it's not a parable, it really is a true story. And this is the end of my talk. Good evening, thank you.